In great literature, the past never dies. It haunts, controls, and sometimes destroys those who cannot confront it. Literature frequently addresses this claim through the tragedy and triumph of its characters. In today's podcast, we are going to respond to the claim: is the past something that traps us, or something that can ultimately free us? To answer this quintessential question, we first need to tackle narratives that showcase the destruction caused by those who failed to address their past traumas. Next, we will highlight one work of literature that counters this idea, and finally, we will return together to consider whether the survival of the past dooms our characters or provides them with the opportunity to soar.
Through the play A Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams illustrates that the past does not die, and the consequences of avoiding previous mistakes dooms the titular character to destruction at the hands of a violent reality. Blanche Dubois is chained by the trauma of her past marriage with Alan Gray, a beautiful and picturesque embodiment of innocence. That is, until Blanche learns of his hidden sexuality. Alan Gray, Blanche's young husband, is found being intimate with his male friend by Blanche. Her cry of, quote, "I saw, I know, you disgust me," unquote, causing Alan to shoot himself in the head, is an assertion that has haunted Blanche for years since then as, quote, "The world was turned off again, and never for one moment has there been any light that's stronger than this kitchen candle," unquote. The mistakes of Blanche's past have had a permanent effect on Blanche's present struggle to find happiness and light in the world. Blanche's former disgust has now been transformed into guilty revulsion for herself, as she recalls, quote, the boy died. I'm afraid I'm going to be sick," unquote. The repulsion that Blanche feels due to her part in Alan's death still has a significant effect on her psyche and physical health, demonstrating the still debilitating, haunting effect of her past. Blanche has attempted to escape this troubling guilt through sexual escapades, including going to the Tarantula Arms looking for her quote-unquote prey, and getting involved in a relationship with her 17-year-old student. However, in attempting to escape the pain of her past, Blanche has only added to the unhappiness and suffering of her life. Indeed, she has created a reputation that will cause her to lose the sources of happiness and growth that she relied on. That is, her relationship with Mitch and her place with Stella and Stanley, dooming her to a tragic reality due to the indelible past. The constant presence of Blanche's grasp onto the past is an ongoing theme within the novel A Streetcar Named Desire. The failed plantation that Blanche used to live on, named quote-unquote Belle Reve, or Beautiful Dream, represents one such illusory ghost of Blanche's past that she clings to. The very name signifies the deceptive nature of the memory, as its status as a plantation signals that beneath the elegant exterior that seemed to be a quote-unquote beautiful dream, there was a twisted nightmare of suffering in the form of slavery. Blanche resembles Belle Reve in this way, as she expresses an aristocratic and delicate image, seen as when she notes her quote-unquote old-fashioned ideals to Mitch as the reason as to why she does not want to pursue any actions further than kissing, purporting herself as someone who does not participate in sexual actions. However, Stanley reveals, quote, "Sister Blanche is no lily," unquote, uncovering that her pure, perfect facade actually hides her sexual escapades and a flawed reputation, caused by her deep inner trauma from Alan Gray's death. In this way, Belle Reve serves as a symbol for Blanche and her past. Blanche felt entrapped in her efforts to uphold Belle Reve, as she states to Stella, quote, "I stayed at Belle Reve and tried to hold it together." Just as Blanche attempted to preserve the crumbling illusion of the past plantation, she attempted in her own life to preserve some quote-unquote magic, rather than let go and heal from her traumatic memories. Though Stella, when running away, escaped the death and grief surrounding Belle Reve, Blanche accuses her, quote, "But you are the one that abandoned Belle Reve, not I," unquote. Blanche feels that she is obligated by duty to bind herself to the past and attempt to guard it, viewing Stella's release from the place as a betrayal and abandonment. Through this, Blanche is entrapped in the illusion that is Belle Reve, just as she is trapped in her life's illusion, refusing to acknowledge reality and dooming herself to destruction down the line.
Blanche displays madness as she retreats back into the delusional world of beautiful dreams. As she is unable to confront her own reality, she is likewise stuck in a past representation of herself, feigning a Southern belle. Her pursuit for a youthful and innocent appearance stems from her trauma following her husband's death, both a death of her picturesque marriage and the pure beauty she imagined he firmly held. As a result, Blanche is unable to leave her past, instead claiming to want magic in the present today through her new relationship with Mitch. This, in turn, results in her downfall, as she is unable to differentiate her delusional life with the brutality of the present. Blanche makes constant efforts to obscure her appearance. She refuses to meet with Mitch before the sunset at 6:30 p.m. and covers any naked light bulb with paper lanterns, further obscuring her facial features to appear youthful and innocent. In A Streetcar Named Desire, Blanche is consumed by her lust for her innocent past and consequentially destroyed by it. Blanche's refusal to accept her past is what allows reality to ruin her. Stanley, the representation of animalistic desire, literally consumes Blanche through a violent rape at the end of the play. In doing so, the author demonstrates both Blanche's powerlessness in her immediate situation and in her eventual imprisonment into a mental institution. Despite the immense difficulties faced by Blanche, her inability to accept and move on from her traumatic past is what eventually leads to her downfall. In an attempt to hide her loss of innocence through advocating to remain pure, innocent, and follow traditional beauty standards, Blanche obfuscates her reality as an aging and traumatized woman. As a result, Blanche's eventual consumption by reality leads to her being placed in the care of an asylum, with her final declaration, "I have always depended on the kindness of strangers," illustrating her refusal to accept reality, lose her desire for innocence, and consequentially, her tragic end of both her character and the play itself.
Going further on, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the past acts as a trap by forcing Hamlet to live under the oppressive weight of memory, duty, and trauma embodied by the ghost of King Hamlet, who is the father of Hamlet. King Hamlet's ghost acts as basically both as a psychological force by enforcing the idea of revenge into Hamlet's mind and as a literal force by acting as a physical representation of the past, disrupting the present corrupted order of Denmark. King Hamlet's ghost appears to Hamlet after being killed by King Claudius, who is his brother, and tells Hamlet, "So art thou to revenge when thou shalt hear," in Act 1, Scene 5, which is basically King Hamlet's ghost telling Hamlet to get revenge on King Claudius on his behalf, proving how the ghost is trapping Hamlet in the past of his death by provoking him to kill on events that already had passed. King Hamlet's ghost is also guiding Hamlet into the path of revenge, while also punishing him by condemning him to a life of corruption, which Hamlet believes is consumed by Denmark already, and is also trapping Hamlet in the process by being in purgatory and making Hamlet have a sense of guilt, shown by King Claudius's ghost saying, Hamlet's ghost saying, "When I too sulphurous and tormented flames must render up myself," and Hamlet's response is, "Alas, poor ghost," which both quotes are from Act 1, Scene 5. Further on, going on into the play, before King Claudius's reign in Denmark, the place functioned as a secure anchor for Hamlet as his home and as a safe place where he could live in harmony. When Hamlet returns from Wittenberg, that home is revealed as an illusion as he realizes the stability he once remembered was merely a facade masking the deep and festering corruption. Hamlet does not accept this reality because Claudius and Gertrude have perverted the family bonds that Hamlet once trusted. Now, he no longer recognizes the court as his home because of that. The past Hamlet once knew that was a place of honor and duty is severed from the present that King Claudius had basically made. So Hamlet is deceived by his own mother and his own uncle, which makes him go mad eventually and makes him yell at his mother, "Mother, you have my father much offended," which is King Hamlet in Act 3, Scene 4. After putting on a play where one brother kills the other by the poison in his ear to basically try and provoke King Claudius to say that he killed King Hamlet. And his madness before then made Hamlet believe the world of Denmark had been gone, ridden with corruption, that it made himself lose all hope, making him to then want to kill himself when he said the soliloquy, "To be or not to be," in Act 3, Scene 1. Basically saying, to live or not to live, that is the question.
Paralysis versus madness. Hamlet's inability to act. Much of Hamlet's disdain towards others, and particularly towards himself, comes from his own inability to act. Hamlet understands that in order to avenge his father, he must kill his uncle, King Claudius, the culprit of the murder, and claim the throne of Denmark. Yet a hesitant nature consumes Hamlet and prevents him from being able to do so. Hamlet laments on this paralysis through a couple of his soliloquies, such as in Act 2, Scene 2. He asks himself, "Am I a coward?" He calls himself pigeon-livered, and that he lacks gall to make oppression bitter. Hamlet mocks himself for his inaction, berating himself for not being able to complete the motives he set himself out to complete at the beginning of the play. The motives that are encouraging him to keep living even though the peaceful slumber of death is all too desirable for him. Hamlet also compares his own doings, or lack thereof, to Fortinbras, the crown prince of Norway. Hamlet watches as Fortinbras courageously leads a massive army towards the castle of Elsinore. In Act 4, Scene 4, Hamlet speaks of witnessing this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince, while he stands with a father killed, a mother stained. Fortinbras is a figure of strength and power, a reminder to Hamlet as to what he should aspire to be. Yet, Hamlet is unable to gather his own strength to get revenge on his father. Hamlet feigns madness to those around him, starting shortly after his meeting with the ghost. But such a madness takes a form of hesitance and reluctance, which ultimately leads to his demise. Hope and resolution, or the lack thereof. Hamlet's inability to act eventually leads to his downfall and death, as well as the death of others around him. The presence of the ghost that claimed to be the spirit of his father, manipulates Hamlet's actions throughout the play, causing him to feign madness until this madness ultimately consumes him, and causes him to be hesitant until he can no longer be hesitant. Hamlet slays Laertes in a battle, Laertes serving as a reminder of what Hamlet could have been and who he could be. Laertes loved his sister Ophelia unconditionally, while Hamlet merely discarded her. Laertes was willing to slay the murderer of his father Polonius once he heard the news, while Hamlet stood still, waiting for the right moment to slaughter his uncle, a moment that would never arrive. Hamlet is unable to be freed from the past, forced to reminisce in the past about his uncle and father's decisions, and his own inability to act on his own decisions. As a result, he ultimately dies, a similar fate to that of his father's, the life that he tried to avenge.
Ghosts and haunting. Are they literal or are they psychological? In the piano lesson, August Wilson uses the ghost of Sutter to show how the past continues haunting Black families long after slavery officially ended. Sutter is not simply a scary spirit wandering through the house. He represents the power of white ownership once had over the Charles family and the emotional scars that the power left behind. Throughout the play, characters argue about whether the ghost is real, but Wilson makes it clear that the psychological haunting matters just as much as the literal one. Boy Willie refuses to be afraid of Sutter because he believes that fear is exactly what kept Black families trapped for generations. He constantly talks about buying Sutter's land, almost as if defeating the ghost means taking ownership of the plantation that once symbolized oppression. At the same time, Bernice experiences the haunting differently because she carries a deep emotional connection to family memory and loss. She avoids playing the piano because every carving reminds her of relatives who were sold away, separated, or worked to death under slavery. The piano itself becomes haunted not by monsters, but by memory. Wilson describes how the piano contains carved images of ancestors, making the past impossible to ignore every time someone looks at it. The family history surrounding the piano comes from the actions of Boy Charles, who stole the piano back from the Sutters because he believed their family's history mattered more than white ownership. That theft led to violence and death, adding even more to the trauma to the instrument's legacy. The ghost therefore symbolizes not only slavery itself, but also the cycle of grief and sacrifice that followed emancipation. Bernice especially feels trapped because she believes touching the piano awakens painful spirits she spent years trying to silence. When Avery tries to bless the house and remove the ghost through religion, Wilson suggests that simple prayers cannot erase generations of suffering. Even Dowager explains with the family story with a kind of exhaustion, as though carrying history has become a burden passed on from one generation to another. The haunting grows stronger whenever the family argues about selling the piano, because the conflict is really whether the ancestors' sacrifices still matter. At one point, the ghost physically attacks Boy Willie, showing how the past refuses to stay buried when people try to dominate or ignore it. Yet, Wilson also shows the ghost is not entirely evil. The haunting forces that the family finally confront emotions they've avoided for years, such as grief, guilt, anger, and fear. In the climax, Bernice finally sits at the piano and calls on the names of her ancestors while she plays. This moment is powerful because she stops running from the past and instead embraces it directly. Rather than trapping her forever, the memory of her family becomes a source of strength. The ancestors seem to answer her through the music, helping drive Sutter's ghosts away from the house. Wilson ultimately suggests that the ghosts are dangerous when ignored, but healing begins once people acknowledge the pain that their history carries. The past traps the living when they refuse to confront it honestly. Once Bernice reconnects with her ancestors instead of fearing them, the haunting transforms from a curse into a form of protection and empowerment. The past as a place. In the piano lesson, August Wilson presents that the past almost like a physical place the characters keep returning to emotionally, even when they tried to build new lives in the present. The piano becomes the clearest symbol of this idea because it literally carries the family's history carved into its surface. Wilson explains that the piano originally belonged to the Sutter family, who traded enslaved members of the Charles family in exchange for it. To replace what the Sutters lost, the enslaved grandfather carved portraits and scenes of his wife and his child into the wood, transforming the instrument into a record of pain, separation, and love. Because of this history, the piano is not simply furniture, it represents generational survival. Bernice sees the piano almost as a sacred memorial to the family members whose suffering made the family's future possible. She believes selling it would mean betraying the memory of her ancestors and treating their sacrifices like property once again. Boy Willie, however, sees the past differently because he wants to use the piano to buy Sutter's land in Mississippi. To him, purchasing the land would symbolize victory over the system that once enslaved his family. Boy Willie repeatedly argued that owning the land is the only way Black men can truly gain independence and power in America. He believes the piano keeps the family emotionally stuck while the land could create an actual future. This conflict makes the play deeply complicated because both siblings try to honor their ancestors, but in two separate ways. Bernice preserves the past by protecting memory, while Boy Willie wants to transform the past into economic opportunity. Wilson refuses to make either character entirely right or wrong. Instead, he shows how difficult it becomes when people inherit painful histories they never chose for themselves. The old plantation system still shapes the characters even after slavery is gone because their inequalities and emotional wounds remain. Sutter's house, the piano, the story Dowager tells, all frozen in time, almost like the South itself refuses to let history disappear. At the same time, Wilson suggests people cannot survive by living entirely inside memory either. Bernice isolates herself emotionally because she fears reopening old wounds, while boy Willie sometimes ignores the emotional importance of family history in pursuit of progress. The world the characters once believed in, whether it was plantation economy, old family structures, or dreams of freedom, have already collapsed, leaving them uncertain about what should replace it. That uncertainty causes much of the tension in the play. Even the younger generation grows up surrounded by the stories of suffering they never directly experienced, proving how deeply the past shapes identity. In the final scene, Bernice finally plays the piano after years of silence and calls upon her ancestors by name. This moment changed the meaning of the instrument entirely. Instead of only being a reminder of pain, it becomes a connection between the past and the present. Wilson suggests that freedom does not come from erasing history or becoming trapped inside it forever. Real freedom comes from learning how to carry the past without it letting destroy the future. By the end of the play, the piano no longer feels like a prison of memory. It becomes proof that survival can be transformed into strength.
Past traps us or frees us within literature, it is important to consider the literary merit of both ideas, which is why we must first consider the argument of paralysis versus madness, answering the key question, why do some characters remain or ignore the past while others are able to move forward? We see it in Hamlet, where Hamlet, he fractures under the weight of the ghost's demand for revenge, and Blanche Dubois' complete shattering as she retreats into mania and she deludes herself to escape her guilt. However, Bernice Charles in The Piano Lesson gives us something entirely different. Bernice doesn't descend into madness, nor is she physically frozen like Hamlet. Instead, Bernice's trauma manifests as a rigid and defensive emotional paralysis. For over a decade, she has lived in a state of self-imposed stagnation where she chose to ignore the past rather than facing it directly. We can see this in how she treats the family piano. She leaves it sitting in the living room as it carries the literal faces of her enslaved ancestors carved into the wood of the piano, showing that the piano is stained with the blood of her father, Boy Charles, who was murdered for it. And what does Bernice do as a result of this? She leaves it to sit like a tombstone. She explicitly refuses to play the piano because she claims that playing it wakes up the dead, stirring up the ghosts and the horrific legacy of the plantation with it. However, by trying to keep these ghosts asleep, Bernice accidentally freezes herself in this moment within her life. She is mourning her late husband, Crowley, and refuses to let herself love anyone else or move forward, showing how she is clinging to this absolute emotional lockdown. This brings us to the core question of why some characters remain trapped in the past while others are able to move forward. Hamlet and Blanche both fail because they treat the past as an absolute and unyielding dictator. Hamlet lets the ghosts of his father dictate his morality in choosing his actions when whether or not to kill King Claudius, while Blanche lets her past and her trauma dictate her sanity, which shows how she descends into mania later in the novel, the play. They can look backward. When they look backward, they see a dead end and are not able to move forward. However, Bernice ignores the past because she thinks Bernice ignores the past because she thinks looking backward will destroy her as well. She confuses preservation with protection, often thinking that by keeping the piano silent and not playing it, she's protecting her daughter, Maritha, from the trauma of slavery. The irony here, however, is that her denial is the haunting, because the paralysis is the ghost. You can't lock a ghost in the closet. So, her refusal to engage with the heirloom doesn't make the pain go away. It only ensures that the pain stays static and yielding and totally in control of her life. But this is exactly where August Wilson pivots and offers his resolution, which is the profound insight that separates The Piano Lesson from the tragedies of Shakespeare and Tennessee Williams. Wilson, as opposed to Shakespeare and Tennessee Williams, he suggests that healing is not a fantasy and is rather actively possible, but requires the very specific condition of confrontation and spiritual acceptance. The Piano Lesson succeeds where Hamlet and the streetcar named Desire fail, because it challenges the definition of what a ghost actually is. In Hamlet, the ghost demands the body count in the form of revenge, whereas in Streetcar, the ghosts of memory demand Blanche's sanity. But in Wilson's play, the ghosts and legacy of the past are actually a call to a spiritual reckoning. And so we can see this in how the climax of the play is a literal battle for the soul of the house. Boy Willie is upstairs and he's physically wrestling with the invisible ghost of Sutter, the white slave owner, and he's losing this fight. The Christian exorcism prayers of the preacher Avery are failing completely. This happens because you cannot use a structured imported ideology to wash away deeply rooted ancestral trauma. It is only when Bernice finally breaks paralysis, crossing the room and sits down at the piano, that everything changes. When she's playing the music, she's commanding the past as she chants the names of her ancestors, the very people that are carved into the wood. Through this action, she's channeling the grief of her ancestors and the strength of her lineage. By playing the piano, Bernice stops running from the ghosts and instead invites them to fight with her. She turns the piano from a dead monument into a living, breathing weapon. This isn't only a less tragic ending than Streetcar Hamlet, but it is clearly a hopeful one. To survive the past, Wilson argues that you cannot romanticize it like Blanche, and you cannot let it paralyze your duty like Hamlet. You have to actively claim it.